Hello. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce. I'm your host, Amanda Del Buno. We're going to get right into our interview today. Christine LaFave Grace was recently joined by Micki Vandeloo, president of Lakeview Consulting, to discuss how manufacturers can obtain grants to support their major projects and initiatives. Here's their interview.
Micki Vandeloo is president of Lakeview Consulting, a Southern Illinois-based consultancy that works with manufacturers, not-for-profits, and other organizations to help them obtain grants to support major projects and initiatives. For manufacturers, beyond the time-intense process of applying for grants and getting the human resources needed to complete applications and navigate the process, often there's not even strong awareness of what kind of money is out there for the asking. We're talking to Micki today to shed some light on that process and the opportunities that many manufacturers may be missing. Micki, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Christine. It's a pleasure.
Okay. So what don't manufacturers realize is available in terms of grants and awards? What specific agencies or entities are offering these grants? And what kind of projects do they support?
Well, I think that's a really great question, Christine, and I think it goes back to what you said, and that's the fact that I've experienced that many manufacturers just don't realize that grants exist at all. They have not had that education. It's not been part of them being brought up in the manufacturing world. So I would say they don't realize that they exist, or they fall into two other categories, which is they have strong misconceptions about what grants are. They think that they're free money, which I bristle at the notion of, basically because no money is free. You have to do something to get the money, which takes time and resources, but also the fact that they feel that grants can get taken away. They heard about a company, rumors. They've heard rumors about grants being taken away from a manufacturer, and really that happens in a very small percentage of the cases, and every time it happens because that particular manufacturer didn't do what they were supposed to do in the grant. I have found that there's a very small percentage, maybe 5 to 10% of the manufacturers that know that grant funding exists, but they don't know all of the grants and incentives that are available to them. So they might have heard of a training grant, for example, or they might even say we've accessed a training grant. And that's great, but there's so many other programs out there, so many other tax credits, so many other grants that could apply to their situation, and I want to make sure they're not leaving any money on the table. Sure. As far as the agencies that typically provide grants, the largest by far for manufacturers is the state economic development agencies. So every state has an economic development agency, and those organizations are tasked with improving the economy of the state, and many times they do that by providing grants. So state economic development agencies can provide training grants, they can provide recycling grants, they can fund very specific apprenticeship type initiatives, they can help companies connect with workers. So there's a lot and train those workers when they get connected to them. So by far that's the largest, but there is some federal funding that is also targeted to for-profit companies. The largest of that is the SBIR STTR funding, which is for high technology research type projects. But again, some manufacturers might be doing that type of research. It's very competitive, and it's not usually the first place I tell a manufacturer to go, but there is some federal funding. There's also federal funding that's passed through to state agencies, and an example of this, and those agencies then will provide funding, and an example is USDA. For rural companies, USDA has what they call the Rural Energy for America program, and that program can fund a portion of the cost of solar panels or wind turbines or equipment that's more energy efficient than current equipment when companies put that in. And that's a really good source of funding for manufacturers as well. So you got the federal funding that falls through the states, you've got actual federal funding that goes directly to manufacturers, and you've got state funding. The third category is the local funding. So a lot of people, a lot of manufacturers don't realize that they're in enterprise zones. And an enterprise zone, just by being in an enterprise zone, those companies can access tax credits that companies that aren't in the enterprise zone can. So we help companies identify if they're in enterprise zones, because surprisingly, a lot of manufacturers don't know that they're in an enterprise zone. So we try to help connect them to these resources that are out there that they don't know about, that can help them access more tax credits, more incentives, and more funding.
That's great. That's great. So, if I'm a small or to mid-sized manufacturer and I'm among the majority who doesn't know that this money is out there, what are some examples? If I've got maybe a major CapEx project on the horizon, I really need to upgrade some equipment, invest in more efficient and more kind of future-focused digitally enabled equipment. What would you tell me? What might be available?
So what I would do is I would really ask you some very targeted questions to start the grant and incentive research project. And that would include, how many jobs are you going to add when you do this project? What kind of equipment are you going to purchase? Is it going to be more energy efficient than what you have right now? Where are you located? Are you located in a rural area or in an urban area? Are you going to be training people as part of this project? The fact is that a project can be funded by a number of types of grants and incentives, Christine. And so the reason why I ask all those questions, how much capital investment are you going to make? Are you going to add a facility to do it? Are you going to add a building? There are specific targeted tax credits and grants for each portion of a project, and those can combine to fund a project. So I might apply to a training grant provider for the training that's associated with a project. I might check to make sure they're in an enterprise zone if they're doing a facilities upgrade or an equipment upgrade or an equipment installation. So that's really what I'm looking for is what are the outcomes of doing the project, and then what grant programs can I help them access. And many times when we do that grant and incentive research, we can find upwards of 10 to 15 different programs for manufacturers.
Wow. I know you can't talk in terms of specifics with maybe specific clients that you've worked with, but you have a favorite story of a company that you helped where, gosh, they didn't realize, and then they got money from different sources and were able to do what they were really hoping to do.
Yeah, I have a great story, actually. I was working for a steel service center in Southern Illinois, and this was back in 2007, or 2008, beginning of 2009, when the recession was kind of coming to an end, but everybody was struggling at that point. And as part of the government's reaction to the recession, they created what was called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ERA funding, which anybody that was in manufacturing or in the economy or watched the news knew about the ERA funding, because they gave money to General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, and it was really controversial. So anyway, one way that ERA funding was distributed was through the states, and the state of Illinois decided to use their ERA funding to support the wind energy industry. So if you've ever driven north to south in Illinois, up north you see there are tons of wind turbines. Many of those were financed through the ERA funding, through that, and that's a really little known fact, but that was when that whole thing really came to a head in Illinois. And so I happened to go to a seminar on wind energy because our company could provide steel for the wind industry. And I found out about a grant program. And the maximum grant that you could get was $650,000. So I went back to the president of the company that I was in, and it was a privately owned company. And I said, I think we ought to apply for this. Maybe we could get some equipment to help expand our capacity, because we knew if we were going to supply to this industry, we were going to have to be able to process heavier grades of steel, so we needed different equipment to do that. And so I looked at the grant, and Christine, literally, I wrote this grant. I found out about the grant on Friday. I wrote the grant on a pad of paper over the weekend, and on Monday, I submitted the grant for $650,000. Well, we got the grant, which was great. It was wonderful. So it was a 2-year time period. So the better part of the story is that, so we bought the equipment that we were going to buy, and I was sending regular updates to the state program officer for the funding. And she called me one day, and this was about halfway through the program, and she said, we just got another $200,000 of funding freed up. By any chance,
Wow.
would you want to buy any additional equipment? And we said, sure,
Wow.
So I went down to the president. They said, we basically had to buy $300,000 because it was a 2/3. We had to match a third of the cost. And they gave me a list of equipment, and I applied, and I got the additional $200,000. Well, that happened several times, and that $650,000 grant ended up being a $2.3 million grant. So this company went from not even knowing that there was grant funding to getting $2.3 million in grant funding that offset about $3.1 million of investment for the company.
Wow.
Now, that was a really specialized grant program. I'm not typically going to find a $2.3 million grant. I'm not going to say it's never going to happen again, but that's not the typical, but it's such a great example of how a company can benefit, because this company ended up applying for other types of grants after that because they were a believer, right? So they wanted to apply for training grants, and they wanted to apply for, if they found out about a grant program, we were applying for it. So, I think it's all to say that while manufacturers may not know about grants and incentives, once we get them the information, they're believers. They believe in it, and we oftentimes help them access those grants and incentives and take them right through the process, and they end up benefiting as a result.
That's great. You've touched on this in terms of the questions that you ask, but who is most likely to get some of these grants? What is going to help an application stand out in the crowd, either in terms of the kind of organization itself or the project or specific purpose that funds are being sought for?
Sure. I think this is a really interesting question, because the whole reason a grant program exists is to fund outcomes. So they're funding what's going to change as the result of doing a specific project, not necessarily the project itself, but what's going to change. So manufacturing funding that exists to create jobs and increase investment at its very core. So the companies that can show an increase in jobs, and usually it's net new jobs. So it is, if you have 100 people now, you need to have 102 people to have 2 net new jobs. And they're going to have some sort of an investment, like a capital investment, equipment. They're putting in a new facility. They're buying forklifts. They're buying processing equipment, some kind of equipment investment. So the ones that typically get the funding meet both of those requirements. They meet the jobs requirement, and they meet the investment requirement. But when you're writing an application, I think what really stands out is not only those 2 components, but it's also how well can you demonstrate the need for what you're asking for. So if you are, for example, developing, I know we're talking about manufacturing tomorrow's workforce, right? So I think one way to do that is obviously by having apprenticeships. And I know you had a previous guest on, I believe, that talked about apprenticeship programs and opportunities for those. There's funding out there to do those apprenticeships in many states, either through the WIOA boards, through their on-the-job training funding. There's funding out there. If you're submitting an application for funding and you can say, we know that 20% of the high school students in this area feel like they have no options when they graduate. They don't want to go to traditional college. They don't want to go in the military, so they're lost. We know that because we've talked to the schools and we've talked to our partners. So we really want to start this apprenticeship right as they get out of high school. We're going to attract these kids and we're going to bring them into the workforce. What better reason to fund a program? I mean, a funder is going to look at that data and say, we need to give some money to this. It's the same reason that people donate to programs like that. Why companies sponsor programs like that, because there's such an economic development impact, and that's really what funders fund. So having the data, having a well-designed project is gonna make funders stand up and take notice. Putting in all the information that they ask for is going to help them stand up and take notice, because you wouldn't believe how many times people will forget to fill out the average wage of the workers that are going to be hired. Very simple information, how many workers are going to be hired, and if you don't fill out those parts of the application, the funder is going to turn it down. So you have to make sure and be very detailed about your answers, and and respond with what they're asking for. So those are some of the ways to get your application to get accepted.
That's really interesting, sort of the community development angle of it. Yeah. I was at an event last week, and one of the speakers is chancellor of City Colleges of Chicago, and he talked about the need for more entry points, more on-ramps to these careers, and whether that's an apprenticeship or another work-based learning program is how City Colleges of Chicago refers to them. It's so critical because, again, if you're looking around, if you're 18 years old and you're not seeing the opportunities there, number one, where are you going? You're not staying in and investing in your community. And number two, then the local manufacturers are missing out on a critically needed talent pool.
Right. And they're really depending on fate, right? They're really depending on they're really depending on that person to just drop from the sky. And how often is that going to happen in a city like Chicago? So I tell companies all the time, because I hear companies say they need workers all the time. I'm like, listen, I can help you find grants to train those workers, but you got to be proactive. You got to go out there and look for the workers. You got to go out and connect with high schools. You've got to talk to people. You've got to use manufacturing data, bring them through your facility. That's the way you get workers.
Yeah, that's great. And again, you're getting to the other, the critical component. The other key partner is educational institutions, community colleges, and other training programs, not-for-profit training programs. Those that are helping to supply that pipeline of talent. Often those are going to be more experienced at applying for funding, but are there programs that even they don't know about or might be overlooking?
Well, I found that really interesting, Christine, that I always thought that, community colleges were right on top of the funding game, because that's how they get their money a lot of times is from state and federal funds. That is not necessarily the case, and it's kind of ironic, actually, because funding has dropped for a lot of community colleges. They don't have the personnel to go out and find and apply for the grants. So a lot of times they're looking to outside resources like ours, and we've worked with a number of community colleges and a number of training or technical training institutions to help them go out and find grants because they know about a grant if it drops in their lap or they've gotten it before, but they're missing a whole lot of opportunities. There's a lot of foundations that fund education initiatives, particularly those that are associated with workforce development. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, and I think it's really important for even people that we would think would be more in tune with that funding, they're not necessarily as in tune with that. The other thing that I've found is that many community colleges and training institutions don't have a great case statement. They don't have a good statement for support. So a lot of times we help those community colleges create a case statement that talks about their programs, that talks about the impact of their programs, that talks about the needs that their programs address. So I think all that is really important, and it's not being done by community colleges and training institutions because they don't have the personnel. Just like manufacturing people don't have the time, a lot of community colleges don't have the time to put into finding and getting grants.
Right. That's so interesting. That's on both sides, common issue on both sides, the resources that we need. Well, Micki, thank you so much for your time today and speaking with us. Really appreciate the great perspective and insights into this whole process.
It's been so much fun. Thank you, Christine.
For Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce, I'm Christine LaFave Grace. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.
And that was Christine's interview with Micki Vandeloo, president of Lakeview Consulting. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with more workforce insights. But until then, catch up on any of our podcasts you might have missed, and don't forget to subscribe to Manufacturing Tomorrow's Workforce. Thanks for listening.